all the rulemaking we've been doing, the depth of rules, the depth of international rules, is only a tiny fraction of the depth of rules that we find in our domestic economies. The question, of course, is who writes the rules? As I said, the rules on trade are easy. Speaking loosely, there should be no rules, or at least no restrictions. International trade should be free. It's one of the very few things that economists agree on. Free trade's a good thing. I don't think we've managed to persuade many people in the public yet, but from the economist's point of view, it's an extremely powerful point. With a few minor footnotes, economists agree that lowering trade barriers will deliver increased welfare to a country, even if the other countries don't follow suit. In this bargaining environment, how can you make a mistake? Now, the WTO might disguise the simplicity of this negotiation framework because it's based on negotiating away each other's barriers. I'll lower mine if you lower yours. This is about politics. I might be able to extract a still greater advantage if, in return for giving away my own trade barriers, I persuade you to reduce yours. But economists support these negotiations not because we support such tit-for-tat bargaining, but because we believe that whatever restriction-lowering outcome can be forced through the political system, it will be economically beneficial for all parties. So what about the TPP? It had a low-key beginning. I mean, it's a kind of, when you hear the start of the TPP, it's a kind of weird idea. Singapore, Brunei, Chile and New Zealand got together and decided they would make the best trade agreement in the world. I mean, these four relatively small countries, very disparate countries, and that might have been headed in its own direction to make the most beautiful thing, but only four countries belonging to it. But at some stage, President Bush, George W. Bush, thought it was a good idea, and now it's picked up. We're up to 12. Recently, Japan has decided to join the negotiations too. 12 countries negotiating, and as Colin said, we're on to the 17th round of negotiation underway in Peru as we gather here tonight. Now, the idea is still that platinum best optimal trade agreement that was envisaged by the four original parties. It was envisaged to be very tough on people who wanted to restrict their trade. New Zealand, for instance, initially opposed Canada joining the negotiations because the Canadians had, from the New Zealand point of view, too much protection on their dairy industry. Now, the trade opening elements, the market access, are obviously unobjectionable. That's, I suppose, in a sense, the central point I want to leave with you tonight, that we have to benefit from that. And it seems an advance on the so-called free trade agreements, which are really preferential trade agreements, should be called PTAs, not FTAs, because they actually discriminate in favour of, discriminate against those who are not included. It offers some hope of overriding that noodle bowl, that spaghetti bowl of PTAs and regional arrangements which we've managed to get ourselves into. It's still not perfect in the sense that it's still not multilateral, it still doesn't cover everyone in the world, and so there's going to be some trade diversion. But it's big enough to make the trade diversion a relatively minor problem. It's nearly 40% of GDP, world GDP, in the countries currently negotiating, and their share of world trade is 25%. So it's an advance on the bilateral FTAs, PTAs. And of course, given the comatose state of the Doha round, some kind of different trade-enhancing strategy is required. So maybe this is it. And the element of that will be a smaller group of players. Can't do the whole world. So it will be a smaller group of players, and so in that sense it's going to be imperfect. But the PTT is about much more than tariff reduction. It's hyped or presented as the new platinum standard of trade agreements covering the behind-the-border issues that are now actually more important than tariffs in trade. Tariffs have come down so much that in fact it's not tariffs that are standing in the way of free trade now. It's various other kinds of rules. An example of the rule is, at least until recently, we kept out apples from New Zealand. New Zealand grows pretty good apples, and they're only not far away. They couldn't bring them in because we claimed there was some kind of blight on their apples. They were kept out for biosecurity reasons. And of course there's a huge range of codes and standards, technical standards, regulations and requirements which confront foreign products arriving in this country. So it would be a great idea if we could make it go smoothly by having the same codes and standards, having essentially Tom Friedman's golden straitjacket. But, as I asked before, whose codes and standards? We all know that our overseas travel would be vastly simpler if the world just came to its senses and adopted Australian electrical plugs. But for some reason they haven't. The grim reality is that any standard, which is, here's the crunch point here, the serious point, any standard which is likely to be adopted in international trade won't be the standard of a small country like Australia. It will be the standard of the big countries. So into the TPP, setting down standards for labour regulations, investment procedures, environmental issues, competition policy, including restrictions on state-owned enterprises and their method of operation, and the one that interests me most, intellectual property rights. Each of these regulatory topics obviously impinges on or is related to trade. So it makes some sense to put them in a trade agreement. Each makes sense in isolation. We want rules on each of these things. Just to take the one on labour regulations a little bit further, inconclusively, the tragic Bangladesh building collapse is a reminder that labour standards are too low in some countries trading in international markets. Those low standards give Bangladesh a competitive advantage in selling clothing to the world. Should we then insist that Bangladesh have the same labour standards that apply in Australia and the US? If we were looking at this issue just from the point of view of keeping the international rules even from international competitiveness, we might argue that everyone should have the same standards. Otherwise, our clothing manufacturers are at a competitive disadvantage. But most people would think that that's taking the argument too far. Part and parcel of the Bangladesh cheap labour competitive advantage is that they aren't lumbered with the same high standards that we, as a rich country, feel ready to impose on our workers. I'm not going to start out on a lecture on what's the right set of labour regulations for the world, on just where the line should be drawn. I just want to say that I'm sure it's not appropriate to impose our advanced world labour regulations on Bangladesh. And I'm equally sure that the TPP doesn't try to do so. The point I want to make is that these behind-the-border issues are not the same as trade. I'll be pounding away at this one simple point. It's my one contribution to this debate. What's appropriate for one country may not be appropriate for another. So there'll be serious and justified arguments about the rules imposed by the TPP, and some countries will end up with rules which are not optimal for its circumstances. Among the behind-the-border issues, the one that interests me most is intellectual property rights. I'm not an expert in this. You need to be a lawyer to be that, and I'm certainly not that. But it's this issue that's led me to take some interest in TPP. I start out from the view intellectual baggage, if you like, that intellectual property rights have on practice been badly handled from an economic viewpoint. How can it be a good idea to create monopolies? That's what intellectual property does. Of course, I believe that morally, those who invent things should get some reward. And beyond the moral case, it's in everyone's interest to encourage the march of technological progress. So an economist asks if the intellectual property framework optimises the rate of technological progress. Again, this means that the rules of society should reward investors. But in what form and how much, I'm reluctant to accept. But I do accept that sometimes this might mean that the law enforces a monopoly. But I also observe how this idea has been perverted by the commercial interests of the owners of intellectual property rights. The Disney Corporation, Walt Disney Corporation, has persuaded the US Congress to keep the Disney copyright going. The famous Mickey Mouse Act, even today, 70 years after Walt's death, copyright is still applying to Mickey Mouse. There's no way that this can be an appropriate incentive for creation. There's plenty of other valid complaints about intellectual property rights, evergreening of patents. But the thing is, Newton said that he saw further than others because he stood on the shoulders of those who came before. But if a patent monopoly stops an innovator from standing on the shoulders of those who come before, then how can we be optimising the advance of technological progress? So in trying to set a reasonable balance between the owners of intellectual property rights and the users, is it in Australia's interest to adopt a set of rules which have been hammered out between the conflicting lobby groups in America? This has been essentially Hollywood versus Silicon Valley. Hollywood wants tight property rights, Silicon Valley wants open rights. I might just add here an extra element, very tentative, subjective kind of element, that I have very little faith in the ability of our negotiators to get an appropriate answer. When the negotiations are packaged up in this kind of gleaming platinum standard set of rules covering a wide range of issues where we will almost certainly have to sign up to rules which are dominated by the largest players. I recall how in our US-Australian FTA agreement, the negotiators essentially had to reach an agreement. They couldn't say, oh well, this deal one isn't a good one for Australia. If they had done that, the Prime Minister of the time would have had to admit that he was not as good a mate of the US President as he wanted us to believe. I think there's a danger in these sort of negotiations that you're swept along by the need to sign an agreement, by the difficulty of saying that we'll fail and walking away. So I think one of the things that we need to think about is under what circumstances would we decide that having negotiated, we're up to 17 times already, having done whatever negotiations are necessary, we decide to walk away from the agreement. I hope people have that kind of, the negotiators have that kind of plan B in their minds. I take heart from the fact that they seem to be ready to walk away from the free trade agreement with China when they realise it's not in Australia's interests. That's so much for intellectual property rights. I'll now trespass into territory which I'm much less confident on, and I'll talk about investment procedures. There's clauses, as you'd understand, as you'd expect, in this agreement, facilitating investment in each other's countries. The basic idea is that a country should treat foreign investors in the same way as well as it treats its domestic investors. But we see various things go wrong in the practice of this simple idea. And Australia has, rightly in my view, become jaundiced about these clauses based on the behaviour of, this is only one example, International Cigarette Company, Philip Morris, that has been upset by the introduction of our strict packaging rules for cigarettes. Philip Morris has taken legal action against Australia based on a trade agreement we have with Hong Kong. I think if the US was serious about putting these sort of clauses on facilitating investment into these agreements, then perhaps they should have a quiet word with Philip Morris management. But in the meantime, Australia shouldn't sign up where such clauses are abused, seems to me clear abuse, in this way. This is an example of why we should be careful. Innocent clauses with good intent, aimed at the highest goals, can and will be misused. Meanwhile, back to the TPP. There's just one last issue I want to highlight. It's universally assumed that China won't be among the initial signatories, supposedly because it may not want to meet the environmental and state-owned enterprises conditions. It may also have trouble with labour laws, the intellectual property rights, and the higher transparency required in economic activities. Now, many assume that this is part of America's intention and ask why. I just quote a Chinese observer on this. This is Professor Lee of the Institute of Asian Pacific Studies, which is part of the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. He says, the TPP is an important part of the US return to Asia strategy that's based on economic and geopolitical security considerations. China containment is an undeniable target of the agreement. He also adds, once TPP is instituted, APEC will be the first to be sidelined. For China, the exclusive TPP will not only bring about the exclusion effect, but possibly reverse the course of the East Asian regional integration that China has been pushing for over a decade. It will constitute a major challenge to China's rise. Now, every time this point is raised, an American official jumps up to deny this, to say China will be welcome when it's ready to sign up to the entry conditions. In other words, come along later. You're not ready yet, but we will welcome you later. The only trick is that when you come along later as an outsider asking to join the club, you don't have any say in the rules that the club has put together. You don't, for instance, have the opportunity to put in place elements of excluding certain very important issues, as no doubt the initial signatories have. Otherwise, I don't see how Japan can join. Now, this stumbling block, if it's related to the importance of state-owned enterprises, it's very hard to follow why China should be excluded, because Vietnam, already a negotiating member, must have the same issues. In any case, just what is there in SOEs that's so objectionable? Certainly, sure, international trade shouldn't be given special subsidies. The SOEs are often the vehicle for special subsidies in China. But surely it's the subsidies that ought to be the focus. After all, we see plenty of subsidies in our own free market inverted commas, economies. Personally, I hope and believe that China will move over time towards a model which gives a larger role to the private sector and private enterprise. But I don't see the private enterprise model as practiced in Europe and the USA over the past 5 years as being so perfect that I would want to force it on a country which is getting along pretty well with a more SOE-based model. China's getting a head start over the West in investment in Africa and the Middle East. And this is in part because its SOEs are prepared to take risks in pursuing China's national interest and taking a longer-term investment horizon. Is this something that we should criticise and try to stop. Now, does China's absence matter? Well, China is the world's largest trading nation. They're our largest trading partner. And you'd have to ask, is excluding them help to make them a responsible shareholder, as people are calling for? I've said that this is a morality tale, and you should make your own judgments about its validity. There's still a lot to be sorted out before we can comfortably sign up to the TPP. And we have to keep in mind that consistent pressure, I think we might, at very least in our negotiation, put forward the idea that China should be offered a more welcome opportunity to join in the negotiations. Because I think if we don't, the Chinese will see this as containment. And we have to ask the question, is this in our interests? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, we've come to questions. I've got a couple of questions first. First of all, as I mentioned earlier, the New Zealand Prime Minister, John Keys, has raised the China question and says, look, why not put this off a bit? Why not discuss this first so that we can see whether China could get in and or could be part of the negotiations? And why do we have to do this by October? We've heard nothing from Julia Gillard. We've heard nothing from Tony Abbott. Actually, we've heard nothing from Wayne Swan or the coalition economic side either. Shouldn't we have had something about this from our leading politicians? Shouldn't we have had at least a debate in Parliament about it?
This seems an easy question. This is, what do they call it? Dorothy Dix answer. Yes. You're probably looking for more of an answer than that, a longer answer, but I can't give one, frankly. The puzzle for me is this idea of the great speed of this, and I don't understand it. It may have something to do with these fast-track authority in the US, but on my understanding they haven't even got the fast-track authority yet, so when they get a fast-track authority, we can start putting time limits on just how quickly it needs to be assessed. But now we've got a 12th country, Japan, has joined the group. Japan must have huge problems in signing up to, this is really a platinum standard agreement. Japan must have huge problems in signing up to it. So these timetable questions, I just put them to one side as just, they don't seem credible to me.
And may I just ask one more, and that is, why not go with the ASEAN answer, which is the one which Indonesia is pushing? In other words, we have an Asian trade deal first, or wider than a trade deal. You know, it could be broader, as you say the TPP is, of course it is. Why not have an ASEAN deal first, and then, having got an ASEAN deal with Australia and New Zealand as ASEAN +2 involved, and then bring in the United States?
This relationship with the RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which is the ASEAN version of the agreement, ASEAN version of trade negotiation, is an interesting idea. When you, one of the few things the Australian negotiators have said is that they see no conflict in negotiating in both streams simultaneously. And I suppose I listen to that and nod and say, okay, if you've got the resources to do this, that may be an okay strategy, because I think they're very, very different kinds of strategies. One is to establish some very high-level rules. You shall do this. You shall sign up for these intellectual property agreements. The other one, on my understanding, is much more deliberate process to look at the actual process of international trade. You offered a very good word that I'm going to put in here. Conduct is the word I'm looking for. On the conduct of trade, so that RCEP is looking at the details of how people trade with each other. RCEP, incidentally, while it's ASEAN-based, is much wider than ASEAN. It's essentially East Asia Summit kind of territory. So if you're trying to think of them regionally, RCEP covers basically the East Asia Summit territory. Now, they could both be concluded as far as if you believe these trade negotiators. Are there conflicts between them? Well, maybe there are, but there are going to be conflicts between any of these existing FTAs and the new ones and the existing Australia-US FTA. All these things need to be sorted out. To have two streams operating in different style of negotiation looks to me to be an okay way to go forward if you've got the resources to do it.
Thank you. Okay, I'll rely on the lady with the microphone there to identify you, because I can't actually see you that well with the lights in. If you could just give your name and your organisation so that we can...
I'm Tony Erickson. I'm an independent management consultant. Thank you very much for your independent, critical talk. Really enjoyed that. You were just talking about the conflict between all the different arrangements. Could you please just comment on how the WTO fits in and all of their rules? Thanks.
Well, it's a good question, Tony. I don't know, but WTO, maybe this is being too frank if I say it seems, I hate to say dead, but there doesn't seem to be anything happening on WTO. So in a sense, it doesn't fit in at all. And I think again, we need to see the possibility of negotiating in different sized groups. In a sense, for a long while, WTO wanted to keep everything multilateral, and in a sense, the FTAs are a breakdown of the WTO process. So in a sense, the damage was done with the FTAs. Once that damage was done, it seems to me an improvement to try to bring them together and make the negotiations between more than two bilateral parties doing an FTA. But whether we could ever get back to the idea of everyone, and we don't get any agreement until everyone agrees on every topic, it just seems a very hard negotiating framework. I mean, it seems a miracle to me that they've ever managed to reach agreement. And it seems to me that Doha must be just about to the stage where you take it offline report. Whether a new WTO head can get it going again, there's a meeting in Bali later in the year. Maybe they can breathe new life into it, but it's very hard to see. So just really saying the same thing again. I think the future is going to be with smaller groups than WTO. The only hope for WTO would be to take some things and countries out of it. Some countries, say, who negotiated within WTO and got a certain distance but couldn't get it over the line, they would then get together and say, look, we, 10 or 20 countries, we think we can do a deal. We can't bring the other 160 countries with us. Let's just do a deal. So in that sense, WTO might be the basis. Those negotiations may not be wasted, but I think the future is with smaller groups.
James Mitchell. I'm in the film business in Australia, and I'll just make the comment that during the last FTA, negotiations. I had some friends in the negotiations, and he said that the real issue that the Australians had was to get access for tomatoes in America, and what the Americans wanted was access for their intellectual property in Australia. Now, I actually have a copy of the chapter on intellectual property, but I think we should appreciate that only 2 of the 26 chapters in the proposed TPP is actually about trade. The other 24 chapters are about what you suggested before, was about the restrictions on the ability of domestic governments to control corporations. And what has been suggested in America is that the corporations will override domestic legislation and regulations, and that whatever barriers or blockages that are occurring in the of the corporation is then compensated by the government of the other country. So the real issues is about the lack of sovereignty that this is proposing, and also the compensation that corporations will expect from the foreign countries. And one of the issues, which I think has been raised by the introduction by the AIIA, was essentially in the pharmaceutical area, is that patents and copyrights will be the fighting ground or the battle ground. And I think, given that, I don't know if many people appreciate it, but the TPP, this agenda, is really the agenda of the Council on Foreign Relations in America. And everyone knows that mostly that is directed at the control by the people in Washington. But I think we should be very careful about accepting these negotiations. But given that the people in Canberra really are just pushing for agricultural access to America, I think we're really behind the eight ball in terms of the intellectual sort of approach that we need to take in this negotiation. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much for that. There is a substantial contribution to the discussion for which I can't add any more. I think if anything it puts some meat on the things that I was saying earlier about intellectual property rights. They're very, very important. I was hoping that we were actually going to get something more than tomatoes. We might get lamb as well. I think the point that somebody might pick me up on is I talk as if we have nothing at stake in being tough on intellectual property rights in Australia. I mean, it is in our interest too to have good intellectual property rules which reward innovation. We could simply say, on balance, there are more users than owners in Australia, therefore we are going to go for something very unfavourable to the owners of intellectual property. But I don't think that's the right way to think about this issue. We want to look at the fact that we have intellectual property rights here. My worry, though, and I think this fits with what Stan's saying, is that these issues are actually being decided not so much at the negotiating table, but among American companies. I'm probably sounding very, very anti-American here, which I'm not. I think it's a great country and has a dynamism that we could all copy. But when it comes to making decisions about things like intellectual property rights, my understanding is that what's happened so far has been the result of the trade-off or the fight between various vested interests in America. I characterise that as being Hollywood versus Silicon Valley, but it's obviously much bigger than that. But the issue in my mind is that in an ideal world you would get academics and bureaucrats and vested interests sitting down and working out what are a good set of intellectual property rights. We will build those that reward innovation, encourage innovation, allow people to stand on the shoulders of those who come before. All of those things, you could actually dream up very good intellectual property rights. But we're not in a framework which gets us to that world. We're in a different framework where vested interests are fighting out to see who wins, and Mickey Mouse won in the case of the 70-year extension of copyright. I'm glad that Stan mentioned pharmaceuticals, and it's actually enormously important to us that we get a good answer on pharmaceuticals. We probably get a fairly good deal in Australia on pharmaceutical intellectual property, in the sense that we negotiate how much our pharmaceutical, our government pharmaceutical purchases are going to pay for drugs, and we have some ability to negotiate the finish of old patents and bringing in a medicine which is not under patent. All of those things, on my amateur understanding, we are doing quite well on now. This could move very seriously in the wrong direction, and it may not be that when all of us go to the pharmacy to get our pharmaceuticals, we may not pay more, but the government will pay more in the top-up. So this is just a huge, intellectual property is just a hugely important topic. And I'm sorry to pound away at this one thing. It is not the same as free trade. We cannot find any simple rule that says the more you give away, the better off you'll be.
This just provokes a quick question. We have a free trade agreement with America now. What happens if we sign a TPP? Will that destroy the basis of the free trade agreement we have? In other words, could we end up with something worse?
I have to confess, I don't know the answer to that. I said at the start that I'm not a trade expert. There must be people who know the answer to that. I haven't seen that issue actually addressed, and it has a much wider application in the sense that there are now zillions, not zillions, but there are a lot of FTAs sitting out there, and there are going to be conflicts between them, and one party will want to use this FTA while the other party wants to do something else. And I just have to say, I don't know.
Thank you, Stephen. Mac Williams, also a former dealer. I was fascinated by I suppose, the general theme of your discussion was just how much we don't know. And I've been spending much more time looking at other parts of our relationship with the US in recent months, in fact a year or so. And there's a huge amount going on that it's not been discussed. There's a policy vacuum in Australia about a lot of this, and particularly with the pivot I'm thinking about. The pivot is going in one direction, driven by American interests. TPP is going in another direction, maybe parallel, maybe connected with American interests. And there are other bits and pieces which go on. For example, the Defence Controls Bill, which eventually got through Parliament last week, which puts very strong restraints on research in Australian universities and research institutes, even stronger than apply to Americans. The original draft would have had a Vice-Chancellor having 2 years in prison and $10,000 fine for allowing research to take place in their institution, which might turn out to be helpful to nasties such as the uraniums and what, or even pieces of materials which are used. So, for example, some of the materials used in melanoma research at Sydney Uni would have been prevented by a theoretical application of this. But coming back from all that, all this is going on in a way that the United States is trying to re-establish itself in the region, the Pacific Initiative, and there's been practically no discussion in Australia about any of this. For one example, which is I've been a hobby horse, but we've ended up with the Deputy Commander of US Army in the Pacific is an Australian. There was never a press release from the Department of Defence in Canberra explaining why we would have done such a thing. And the debates that are going on all the way through this, we've just had, I've just seen a photograph of him in Australian uniform in Korea chairing an operational meeting of American and Korean forces, potential problems with North Korea. This is all going on, the TPP is going on. I wonder where it's headed, because I don't think that the United States itself has really got a consolidated view of this, but I'd be interested if you picked up any sort of connection. I just don't think the two things are going unconnected, but I'm not sure how they're connected.
Thanks, Matt. That takes us on a territory that frankly is, I'm not a trade expert, but certainly not a foreign relations expert. The thing that strikes me as I listen to that discussion is just how hard it is to have a transparent discussion about all of those issues. For Australia to get the right message to China and the right message to the US and talk about the tail risks, the small risks that we need to worry about with our defence. I think to do all of that publicly, very transparently, is proving extremely hard. So as a former public servant, you too, so you know how hard it is. It's actually much better sometimes if you can close the door and do the negotiations behind closed doors. It's not a very popular idea, I know, but sometimes that's where we go. I personally would be happy enough to see that happen if I saw constant demonstrations that the people who are doing the negotiation, if they really showed me how competent they were, they really, our trade negotiators said, came out of the negotiation and said, I can't tell you how far we got on tomatoes, but I'll talk in terms which will convince you that these negotiations are in good hands. I don't even see that lack of transparency.
Keep that in member. Thank you for a moving address. Can I take up a couple of points and ask, assuming that our government signs the TPP, to what extent will that interfere with our trade with China, Indonesia and other countries, given the number of ways in which that can be impeded by regulation, embargo, etc.?
I think this is a good question. I'm not very positive about the answer, but if we ended up signing both of them, we got an RCEP and a TPP, at least the way the negotiators talk, that would be an okay outcome. We go on trading with China, we go on trading with Indonesia, we do that under, basically under the RCEP framework, but under whatever other frameworks are going, including maybe bilateral FTAs. And similarly, we are adhering to a set of platinum rules in our dealings with the TPP countries. I think that would be okay. My first reaction when I saw that we were negotiating in two places, I thought, you couldn't have two things going at once. But in my amateur state now, I'm buying the line that you can, and it'll all be okay, and it'll work out all right on the night.
Thank you.
Thank you for your talk, Stephen. I'm currently an intern here in the advisor to the Consul General of Korea. I just have an interesting, I've just got a question from a a cabinet policy perspective, to what extent do you think the current Gillard government or the next elected government will prioritise negotiation of the TPP with its current negotiation projects, such as negotiating an FTA with India or Korea? How are those two very different priorities be balanced moving forward from a policy perspective? Thank you.
Thanks, Jade. I have to give a quick answer because the truth is I don't know. But all I can say is it looks like the Americans are putting a lot of pressure on countries, not just Australia, but on my understanding on, for instance, Indonesia, which is not even a negotiator in the TPP, to get along with this TPP and get aboard. So I think it will be very hard for any government after September to resist going along at whatever pace the TPP is running. Whether that stops them from doing other things, I don't know. But the TPP, while it's running, I think the whip will be on us.
How to avoid situation in European Union when you got some countries, South countries, with basically more less industrialized, with tourism resources like Spain, Greece, because as you know, this country they put the industrial tariff to zero, and actually we can see that from European Union, best benefit got Germany and high industrialized countries, which get actually free space for exporting very expensive industrial products, and we see that actually it's much less better is happened to these South countries. And how Australia can avoid some similar situation that actually this trade can ruin the industry and put Australia in some less favorable position. And is there any parallels between European Union and this structure?
Well, it's hard to know how to comment. It's a good question. This is the sort of argument I have with members of my family, intelligent people, but not economists. They do not buy the line that free trade is a good idea. As far as I know, if you poll the Australian public, maybe 1% would understand and agree with the idea that free trade is a good idea. But I'm in that tiny fraction that believes it's a good idea. So that I think Australia should open itself up to the outside world. In the process, the car industry would be radically changed and perhaps disappear. I think we should do it without defence procurement. I think the idea of building submarines in Australia is just a way to impoverish the nation by doing things that you shouldn't be doing. So I'm on the opposite side of the arguments. I would accept, however it works out in terms of free trade. In the process, I have enough faith in Australia's education system and dynamism that I think it'll work out all right for us. I think so far it is working out all right for us. We have opened up hugely in the last 25 or 30 years, in the process losing great swathes of manufacturing industry, but getting into a whole lot of industries that we didn't dream about before, and exporting a lot of them. You go around Asia and you find Australian engineers and architects and technicians doing all sorts of things that you didn't even dream we could do. So it's an unsatisfactory answer, I know, because it's the answer that only 1% of the population believes in. and it leaves you with that feeling that globalisation has been is bad for countries.
Is there one more question somewhere?
Just to put your minds at rest, I wrote it to Paul Fletcher, who is my local member for Bradfield, and he never heard of the TPP. And he wrote to the Minister for Foreign Affairs and got a bland reply and said that Julie Bishop, who was actually the Shadow Minister for Trade, had never heard about it all also. So I don't think 4 weeks is going to be sort of very, very much. But I think one of the issues, of course, is that the free trade movement is actually, in America anyway, the protests are actually anti-globalisation. Because in America, as you probably appreciate, is that there's been a huge offshoring of jobs to China and to Southeast Asia and sometimes into North Africa. And this is causing, the sort of problems that people have if they keep actually going in the free trade route, is that all the jobs are going to disappear. And the way they're disappearing is because the developing countries are actually grabbing onto the new technologies to make themselves more efficient, whereas the older economies are still struggling in the 1960s, particularly in Australia, where the manufacturing sector is really a long way behind. And what China is doing is taking all the manufacturing machinery from Germany, which is why Germany is very strong, and leaping over all those countries that are not embracing innovation, which you see when you talked about before. And that's the problem in Australia. We're a very parochial, insular country, and we can't rely on the mining boom, and we can't rely on the real estate boom, which is going to end in tears. And we haven't accepted that. Generally, the public sector doesn't understand it, and the mainstream media doesn't talk about it.
What can I say? I don't think economists have ever persuaded anyone other than other economists that free trade and globalisation is a good idea. All I can say is I think Australia has embraced it, whether the public liked it or not, largely embraced it, and I feel we've done well with it, and overall the unemployment rate in Australia, 5.5%, is pretty good. So I think Australia is actually a demonstration that you can embrace globalisation and get the benefits of it, and not end up with everyone flipping hamburgers. But the test is never over, and you might be right. We might have been living in a fool's paradise for the last 10 years with the mining boom, and if we meet again in a year or two, I won't be able to say that we've got 5.5% unemployment. I accept that China is jumping over, and the rules of comparative advantage may not always apply. I've actually tried on Ross Garnaut, Australia's great China guru. I once said to him that I thought that China had comparative advantage in everything. It was meant as a joke, but it has a serious point that China is producing just about everything, and it's hard to see where other countries come in. He told me I should go back and do first year economics again, but when you look at the situation we're in now, because we made some hard decisions about restructuring quite some time ago, 20 or 30 years ago, we're in a better position than other countries. Manufacturing is now less than 10% of employment. What's it less than? I used to have a whole lot of other industries which are certainly less than retail and all of those things. Manufacturing is now very, very small in Australia, and the things that we're good at are things that we probably didn't dream about before, but we actually do have architects and engineers and so on taking their skills to the world. Whether we can keep it going, I don't know, but so far so good.
The problem is 16% is the unemployment rate for those under 18. Youth unemployment rate is very high in Australia, and I don't really think, Morris Newman was the only one that mentioned it in an article that he wrote a few weeks ago. I have never seen either Joe Hockey or Wayne Swan talk about it. Yeah. And I think, you know, what I was really saying is that in America, the media now have basically agreed or accepted that most of the stuff that's in the mainstream media now is propaganda and spin from governments. 2 or 3 days ago, my son sent me a note saying that the Gillard government have now accepted that they are now blocking websites that criticise the Gillard government. And if there's no information, then the bureaucrats in Canberra, which are totally isolated from the rest of the world, basically don't know what's going on. Now, during the G20 meeting in Cairns in 2011, I was in northern Iraq, and I obviously had nothing to do except watch Bloomberg. But what happened after that was that the head of Citibank Europe, who is now the head of Citibank in New York, said the real problem with their discussions at the G20 was that the politicians and the policymakers had no idea how the financial sector was evolving. And so it's taken years and years and years now for them to get their head around what needs to be done in Europe, which is in depression. And with 67% of unemployment or youth unemployment in Greece and over 60% in Spain, obviously they have still no idea how to get changes, to make the changes so they can get back onto a growth curve. They haven't. And I really worry that the people here haven't got the intellectual capacity to get us onto a growth spurt. They're just worrying about all the mining going to China and wherever and thinking that's going to be our saviour.
Well, certainly there's the situation in the peripheral countries of Europe is parlous, and if you're a 25-year-old there, the best chance is to kiss your family goodbye and go somewhere else.
I agree, yeah.
But in a sense, that's the contrast. We're here. They messed up policy extremely badly over a long period of time. We didn't get it exactly right, we got it sort of right. And I think that this is almost a footnote, but this question of youth unemployment, it's very hard to even work out what the right figure for youth unemployment is, because you don't know what to put it over. You know how many unemployed youths there are, but you don't know whether to put it over just those in the labour force, or to also add in all the people of that age group who are doing education and other things. And whether you do that just changes the figure completely. So one reason why people don't talk about those figures is they are so hard to look at what the right figure is. Now that doesn't say, I'm not taking a position on whether youth unemployment is good or bad. I don't know. I think it's too hard to know.
Just came out of Bank of America, that figure.
Yeah, but all I say is you can calculate it 2 different ways. It's a ratio, what you put on the bottom of the ratio. If you want to make it sound bad, if you want to quote for 60%, what you do is you count up the number of unemployed youths, and you put it over the number of working youths. And that gives you a very bad figure. But if you, instead of putting it over the number of working youths, you put it over the number of working youths plus the number of youths who are doing other normal things for that age group, in other words, getting education, the view completely changes. And I don't know how we get the truth out of those things.
Sorry, but I'm going to have to cut you off there. Of course, just in a comment on what the gentleman said out there, of course, one of the reasons, one of the problems of the world was because the politicians didn't understand how the financial system was working, or rather going wrong a few years ago. Anyway, that's just my comment. I'm going to ask Robert Pritchard, who is a lawyer and also a resources lawyer, runs a company called Resources Law, to give a vote of thanks in a moment. But before I do, I just want to tell you about two coming events. One on Thursday, when we have our second cultural event. This is a drama at Carriage Works, which is just behind Sydney University, on what's happened to Asian migrants over the years they've been in Australia. There's those that came 10, 15 years ago, there's those that came on boats, on planes, or whatever. And this has been dramatised by an all-Asian company with an all-Asian acting force. And we have got discounted tickets for this, so $25 instead of the normal $35. And we've just got a few tickets left. If you'd like to come on Thursday to Carriage Works, Jenny will tell you how to book online, or you can go onto our website and figure it out for yourself. It's not that straightforward, but just follow Book Online and you can do that. And there will be a talk by the director of the play at 6:30 with drinks and refreshments beforehand, which is also part of the whole deal. So this is a good deal if you'd like to come to that. And then next week, we're looking at the situation in Malaysia. There have been elections in Malaysia. They were said to be corrupt. The government was returned. The opposition hasn't really accepted the result. So there's a lot of tension there, potentially racial tension. And our speaker next week is an associate professor at Sydney University, Lily Rahim, who is an expert on this subject. She's been to Malaysia, she comes from Singapore. As I said, she's an assistant professor at Sydney, has written 2 books on the subject, is very well informed, and I think you will enjoy listening to her at the same time next week. So I hope you can come then, and over to you, Robert.
Thank you, Colin, and Dr. Grenville. It's my very great pleasure to propose a vote of thanks to you. It's particularly reassuring that we have an expert from the Lowy Institute come along to the Australian Institute of International Affairs. We're the sort of the people's Lowy Institute of Australia. We don't have quite the resources of the Lowy Institute, but we made up for it in our passion. But insofar as tonight's presentation was concerned, I found it most stimulating. I have a criticism of it, but I also have praise. And the criticism is that we covered such a wide field, or we attempted to cover such a wide field, that we were lurching from one issue to another, and there was no real pattern or coherency about things. That's just the nature of this subject, I'm afraid. But I nonetheless make the point because, not so much by way of criticism of what we've addressed tonight, but because of the complex nature of this problem. Stephen made a point really at the beginning, which really I think is the mini thesis of tonight's talk, and that is that he sees the future revolving around negotiations on a minor scale between limited numbers of players. And I think that is absolutely right on the mark. The whole history of the WTO, which was designed to make the world a totally free trade area, is that it's got bogged down in complexities because of the huge number of parties involved in the process, which has made it so complex and so time-consuming. I think Stephen didn't say this, but I think really the WTO has become completely paralysed in terms of its ability to deliver results. And a lot of people like, for example, Peter Drysdale, who's talked to us not so long ago, Professor Peter Drysdale from ANU, who said, yes, but we should still keep going along those lines, because then everyone is equal and we all share in the benefits on a global basis. Once you start making free trade agreements with individual countries, you actually set up, as Stephen mentioned, preferential trade agreements with those countries, and you exclude all the others. And so there's a whole conflicting school of thought here amongst the economists. Yes, you should, one says you should have free trade right across the board through the WTO and very wide regional agreements, and the other one says, no, you should take whatever gains you can get as fast as you can get them, and you can do that more effectively and more efficiently and faster by having free trade agreements on a bilateral basis. So the result of it is you've got one free trade agreement laid down by the WTO, and you've now got around the world thousands and thousands and thousands of these little free trade agreements, as Stephen describes them, preferential trade agreements amongst individual countries or groups of countries. Where then does this PTT fit into the whole scheme of things? And Stephen makes a very good point that America's jumped aboard and wants to get everyone signed up as soon as possible. He also makes the very good point that China is not a party. Now, what on earth does Australia want with an agreement which doesn't involve China as a party? I just leave you with that. Could I please ask you to join me in expressing your appreciation?